Welcome to No User Manual, a podcast for life without instructions. I'm Victoria Fontana. In this podcast, I'm exploring the patterns of the mind and body that make us human, the ones that can trip us up. Patterns I notice in myself and that keep showing up in my classes and coaching, and nobody hands you a manual for any of this. And I certainly don't have the instructions. But I do have a practice rooted in mindfulness and compassion that I keep coming back to. And these patterns make complete sense. You're not broken, and there are some things worth trying. So here we explore what it might feel like to meet them a little differently. I'm glad you're here. Today we're working with how our minds can replay conversations. And this is a very common thing that we do as human beings. We like to go revisit things and see if we could fix them, or replay a conversation, or try something different, or show up in a different way, right? You're in a meeting, you share an idea, you like your idea, and the conversation just moves on. People don't really pay attention much to it. Maybe they kind of dismiss it a little bit, but nothing dramatic really happens. But then later that evening, the moment returns, the mind starts to replay the conversation and the comment that you made and the way that people just moved on. And you have this whole kind of internal thing that starts to happen, right? You remember what you said and you start to notice body reactions, maybe some tenseness or discomfort. And then those questions come up. Did they understand me? Why did I offer that idea? Maybe I should have done it in a different moment or a different way. And then the conversation really has been over hours ago, but now your mind and body are reacting as if it was a movie you're watching and you were like living that out, right? So internally, the mind and body are responding to something way in the past. So you might recognize this experience maybe after a meeting, or after you sent an email, or maybe in a conversation with friends, something you say at dinner. And then the mind often puts those reviews on your schedule. No, I think we'll talk about this again at 3 a.m. and see how we do. So why does the mind do this, right? I mean, this is totally a normal thing for all human beings, but I don't know many people who like it. So why do our minds do this? So on one end, we could really be a little kind to ourselves and think about how actually the mind is probably trying to protect us. We know that humans need groups, right? We don't survive really quite well without a group around us. And so this acceptance of the group is kind of related to our actual survival. And we know that our brains and our minds monitor these social signals, right? And it looks out for things to catch anything that might be getting in the way of us belonging, of us being successful. And then when there's some little cue that makes the mind feel a little bit uncertain, or something's not right here, it starts to analyze and ask questions and then replay that moment over and over again, right? And so there's this part of our brain that's paying attention and really monitoring for any possible threat. It wants to protect us from anything. And from the brain's perspective, that's its job, right? It has to keep us safe. And it does. I mean, essentially, right? So when it's supposed to be doing that, that's great. But as we've talked about in other podcasts, sometimes this negativity bias gets in our way. And so the same thing may be happening when we're replaying these conversations. The problem with this is that we start to create a story. So from a moment in the past, right, that whole moment kind of fades in the past. And then the mind starts to create stories about it, right? Because it has to fill in some information that it doesn't know. So I don't know what those people were thinking in the meeting. My mind is creating the story around what I think they might have been thinking, or all of the possibilities. The mind will kind of show up and make its interpretations. And then the body reacts, right? And so now I get some tension. I'm feeling maybe embarrassment or emotions of, anxiety, stress. And then that creates more thoughts. And then I might have even more opinions about the fact that I'm ruminating about something, right? So you can see how this really gets on its own kind of Ferris wheel, and the conversation itself is no longer happening, and we're not even actually replaying that conversation. We're in another conversation, right? We're in the story that our mind has created about the conversation. So maybe you remember the last time this happened to you. What was your mind trying to figure out? What was the scenario? Maybe it was trying to figure out if things went well, or if you were understood, if you belong. we could look at what's underneath this because it's often a deeper layer, right? It's not just about the meeting or the idea. It's about this deeper need to be understood, to be seen positively, to belong, our wish to belong as human beings and to feel like we matter. And maybe it's also a sign that we really care about our interactions. We care about the people we work with. We care about, our impact. And so I think that there's a little twist though in the logic, which is the more I think about it, the more I'll understand and I could possibly fix things or make things better or make sure that nobody walks away with the wrong impression of me or whatever it is. And essentially then I can avoid feeling vulnerable and feeling embarrassed. So my mind is really trying to regain control over something that, number one, it's already in the past, and that it can't control because there's no possible way I could have all that information unless I went around and interviewed everybody and made everybody replay the whole scenario and asked them all what they were thinking, right? Which is not very realistic. So where do we go from here? I want to introduce a shift that you could make, and it's through the practice of mindfulness. And so I'm just going to introduce a piece of mindfulness that is this part of our practice that we recognize patterns. And so instead of, pushing away the replay or even stopping the replay, which is our natural, wanting to push it away or doing something to make it stop, right? Then we actually open to and recognize what's going on. We actually take this completely counterintuitive approach to noticing what's going on. So we have this kind of metacognitive awareness of what's going on. So I say, well, my mind is thinking, there's a pattern, I'm remembering a conversation, I'm trying to fix things, and I can notice the thoughts that are going through my mind. I can notice the body sensations that I'm experiencing, and I could notice the emotions and any urges to act that I might have. And just by becoming aware, we start to see the patterns instead of being kind of stuck inside all of that narrative and thought. And when we start to see patterns, we may not like them, but it gives me a lot more leverage than if I don't see the pattern at all, right? I kind of equate it to like when there's something in the kitchen that smells, right? Like maybe a rotten onion. If you just ignore it and maybe you put in some spray to cover it, you're not really getting rid of the onion, right? You're not really solving the problem. So what we're doing in mindfulness is we're opening all the cupboards and we're seeing what's there and we finally find the onion. Now we might not want a rotten onion in our cupboard, but once we see it, now we have some choices of what to do with it. And so sometimes this can feel really unfamiliar and actually kind of challenging because we don't like what we're thinking and what we're seeing and what we're feeling. And so one of the things that I want to invite in is kind of a quieter and more gentle approach. Number one, that we don't need to fix anything when we're looking at all of this. We're not even trying to like throw the onion out, right? We're simply noticing. And we're making a conscious effort not to suppress or push it away, which can feel challenging and difficult, and allowing the experience to be there. And also we want to bring in some protective attitudes, which the biggest one we want to bring in is kindness. And so when we respond with kindness or even whatever that might mean for you, I do it with a lot of humor, like, oh, there we go again. Like I kind of want to lighten it up a little bit and to say, I can notice my patterns. I can notice what's going on. I can even notice my not being happy with what's going on. I don't have to like it, but I can be with it. And so this kindness comes in where I can soften to it, open to it, and I can bring in these attitudes also of non-judging, or at least noticing if there's judgments and not taking them so seriously, allowing things to be there for a little bit and getting curious about my experience. And so just like you would put on a protective suit if you were going to do a sport or go scuba diving, we kind of put on these protective attitudes in mindfulness so that when we're looking at our experience, we're prepared and we can look at it with that intention of being kind to ourselves and not judging. Because mindfulness is the practice of doing that over and over again. And so right now our minds are on autopilot doing something else over and over again, which is replaying. We're trying to shift that and do something we're choosing to do over and over again, which is becoming aware with kindness, with curiosity, with non-judging. And then over time, something subtle may change. I've noticed that the replay still happens, but I'm aware of it. I can see it. It doesn't have such a big sting. It doesn't trap me as quickly. And so I can recognize that pattern. I can see the story that's forming and how my mind's taking me into this time travel. and I can notice my body reacting. And all of those are cues that help me recognize, ooh, here comes that mental loop again. And I get some space when I create that awareness, and that story really doesn't have as much of a grip as it used to have, right? So that's really the impactful piece of this practice, where we, over time, begin to start to see how it loosens its grip, and then I have choices. The mind replays things to help us, and we can befriend the mind. We don't have to push it away. And we do this in a way that feels right to us. So maybe we start gently and with small things. And then when we recognize the story that's forming, then we can start to be aware of it and maybe even question it a little bit, or soften it. And so we start to create that space so we can make some choices that are more helpful. Noticing that pattern may shift something in us, and the replay becomes more of something that we notice and less of something that we're entangled in. And so if this is a pattern that you recognize, then the invitation here is to really simply get curious about it, perhaps open to it and see what's there. Maybe you can meet that moment with kindness. So thank you for listening. This has been No User Manual, a podcast for life without instructions. I'm Victoria Fontana. And in our next session, in our next episode, we'll be exploring this a little bit further and looking at then that critical voice that shows up around these replay conversations. So hopefully I'll see you then. Take care.